Hello, my lovely friends. How are you today? I hope you're having a lovely one wherever you are. My name is Liz, and we're going to be talking about some murder today. If you're new here, I sit down, talk about some stuff, talk about some creepies, and yeah, if you like my content, you want to join this fam, as I said, we're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murders, also known as the Leather Apron. So this is a unidentified serial killer in act of that was active in impoverished Whitechapel in the East End of London in 1888. So there is in both criminal files and contemporary journalistic accounts, this killer was known as the Whitechapel murderer or the Leather Apron. So these attacks involved female prostitutes who lived and worked in the slums of East End in London. Their throats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations. There was a removal of internal organs from at least three of the victims that led to the thought that the killer had anatomical and surgical knowledge. There were rumors that the murders were connected, and the connections were rumored to have intensified between September and October of 1888, and this was due to numerous letters being received by media outlets in Scotland Yard from individuals believing to be the murderer. So the name Jack the Ripper actually originated from a letter written by an individual claiming to be the murderer. And this was taken by media and it was dubbed Jack the Ripper. The later was widely believed to have been a hoax, and they believed it was written by journalists in an attempt to heighten interest in the story and increase the newspaper circulation at the time. So this letter, they call it the From Hell letter, was received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and so this letter came with half of a preserved human kidney as well. That was taken by one of the victims. The public became aware, and they increasingly came to believe that this serial killer was known as Jack the Ripper, mainly due to the extraordinary brutal nature of the murders and the media coverage of the crimes. So police investigated a series of 11 brutal murders committed in Whitechapel and in Spitalfields between 1888 and 1891, but they were unable to connect the killings. So the five victims in Whitechapel are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Elizabeth Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These are known as the Canonical Five. Their murders were between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, and they're often considered most likely to be linked. These murders have never been solved, and there is obviously a lifelong legend that surrounds these cases. And this is also known due to historical research, folklore, and pseudo-history, and it is still talked about at this time. So, in October of 1888, it was determined that there was about 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel. And with that, about 8,500 of them resided in the 233 common lodging houses in Whitechapel every night. And they asked for a price of 4 pence for a bed every night. And this or a hangover, which is rope stretched across the dormitory, which was about 2 pence per person. Whitechapel was not very wealthy at this time, and this is due to a steady rise in social tensions. So between 1886 and 1889, there was frequent demonstrations that led to police intervention and public unrest, such as the Bloody Sunday in 1887. This is where protesters were protesting about unemployment and coercion in Ireland. And basically, long story short, The people clashed with the Metropolitan Police and the British. Ended up with 400 arrests, 75 people were badly injured, including many police officers. 2 police were stabbed, and 1 protester was bayoneted. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism, crime, nativism, racism, social disturbance, and severe deprivation that influenced public perceptions when it came to this case in Whitechapel. And these perceptions strengthened during the course of these crimes in 1888 due to the grotesque and vicious nature of these murders and how it was covered by the media. So a large number of these attacks against these women happened in East End, and it's during this time it's uncertain how many victims were actually murdered by the same individual. They don't know. Now, like I said, there was 11 separate murders that happened between the 3rd of April of 1888 and 13th of February of 1891, and these were included in the London Metropolitan Police Services. They investigated some of these, and altogether they were dubbed the Whitechapel murders collectively. A lot of opinions arose due to these murders, and whether they should be linked to the canonical 5 were widely believed to be the work of the Ripper. So most of the experts that looked at these bodies pointed at the deep slash wounds to the throat, followed by extensive abdominal and genital area mutilation, the removal of internal organs. There was facial mutilations that they've never seen before, and distinct features of the Ripper's MO present in these 5. The first 2 cases of the Whitechapel murders of Emma Smith and Martha Tabrum were not included in the canonical 5. So Smith was sexually assaulted and robbed on Osborne Street in Whitechapel. This happened at about 1:30 a.m. on the 3rd of April of 1888. She was bludgeoned on the face and received a cut to her ear. There was a blunt object that was then inserted into her vagina, which ruptured her, what do you call peritoneum? Yeah, peritoneum. She developed peritonitis, and she died the following day and at the hospital. So Elizabeth stated that she was attacked by 2 or 3 men, one of whom she describes as a teenager, and this attack was linked to the later murders by the press, but it was deemed unrelated due to the thought of East End gang violence. So Martha Tabrum, she was murdered on a staircase landing in George Yard in Whitechapel on the 7th of August of 1888. She suffered 39 stab wounds to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, stomach, spleen, and abdomen, with additional knife marks inflicted on her breasts and her vagina. So all of one of Martha's wounds had been inflicted by a bladed instrument, which was called a penknife. With one exception, all of the wounds had been inflicted by a right-handed individual, but Martha had not been raped. So due to how savage this murder was, and the lack of an obvious motive, and the closeness and location and the date to the later 5 murders that were linked to the Ripper, they couldn't determine whether or not they were by the same man. However, so when they looked at them, obviously how she was mutilated, they could kind of connect to the other ones, but it didn't follow the same MO. So the body of Mary Nichols was discovered at 3:40 a.m. on 31st of August of 1888 in Bucks Row, which is now called Durward Street in Whitechapel. She was last seen alive about an hour before her discovery by a Mrs. Emily Holland, with whom she shared a bed at the common lodging on Thrall Street, and she walked in the direction of Whitechapel Road. She was found with her throat severed by 2 deep cuts, one of which completely severed the tissue down to her vertebra. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen had been ripped open by a deep, jagged wound, causing her bowels to protrude through her stomach. There were other incisions inflicted on both sides of her abdomen, and they determined that it had been caused by the same knife. And each of these wounds had been inflicted in a downward thrusting manner. So if said killer was right in front of her, they had knife and they just right into her in a downward motion. So you know how you stab like forward? This person had it stabbing downward. About a week later, the body of Annie Chapman would be discovered at 6 a.m. This was on the 8th of September of 1888. She was found near the steps of a doorway of the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. And as in the same case as Marianne Nichols, Annie's throat had been severed by two deep cuts. Her abdomen had been cut entirely open. There was a section of her flesh, of her stomach, that was placed on her left shoulder, and another section of her skin and flesh, plus her small intestines, removed and placed above her right shoulder. Her autopsy revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had been removed. So clearly, this is somebody that has a specific medical background that is stealing things from her body and dissecting her in a way that nobody's ever seen. So when they looked into the murder of Annie, a woman named Elizabeth Long described seeing Annie standing outside of 29 Hanbury Street at about 5:30 a.m. and she was in the company of a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker hat. Now, a deerstalker hat is one that's typically worn outdoors in rural areas, and it's associated with Sherlock Holmes. He also had a dark overcoat and a kind of like a shabby appearance. And according to an eyewitness, the man had asked Annie, "Will you?" And to which Annie then replied, "Yes." That was it. So Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed in the early morning hours of the 30th of September of 1888. Elizabeth's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard off of Berner Street, which is now Henriques Street in Whitechapel. So her cause of death was a single clear-cut incision measuring about 6 inches across her neck, and this had severed her left carotid artery in her trachea before the cut ending beneath her right jaw. So the absence of any further mutilation to her body led to uncertainty whether or not Elizabeth was in the company of a man or close to Berner Street on the evening of the 29th and in the early hours of the 30th. But people that saw her said that they had differing descriptions of her being with a person. Some said that her companion was fair, others said that they were dark, some said that he was shabbily dressed, and others say he was well dressed. So there's a lot of different point of views when it comes to this. So Catherine, she was found in a corner of the Meter Square in London, 3/4 of an hour after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride. Now, Catherine's throat had been severed ear to ear, like a Glasgow smile, but throat-wise. So instead of across the face, it's across the throat. Her abdomen had been ripped open by a long, deep, jagged wound before her intestines were placed over her right shoulder, much like that of Annie Chapman. And there was a section of intestine that was completely detached and placed between her body and her left arm, kind of like she was holding it in a way. Her left kidney and major part of her uterus was removed. Her face was severely disfigured, her nose severed, her cheeks slashed, and cuts measuring about 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch, like respectively, vertically incised through each of her eyelids. There was a triangular incision at the apex of which pointed towards her eye. So I think towards her eye, yeah. Her and she also had carve markings on her cheeks. A section of her auricule which is part of her ear, and the lobe of her right ear was later recovered from her clothing, so that had been cut off. So the surgeon that conducted her post-mortem stated that he believed these mutilations would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete. There was a local tobacco salesman, Joseph Lowand. Yeah, Lowand. He passed through the square with two friends shortly before the murder and described seeing a fair-haired man, shabby appearance, with a woman who may have been Catherine. His companions were unable to confirm his description, and the murders of Elizabeth and Catherine were ultimately known as the double event. So, a section of Catherine's bloodied apron was found at the entrance of the tenement at Goulston Street and Whitechapel at 2:55 a.m. And there was a chalk inscription on the wall directly above the apron. And so this, I think, is a way to throw them off. Now, it said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffiti became known as the Goulston Street graffito. And the message clearly implied that a Jew or Jews in general were responsible for this. So, hence the Semitism. The police commissioner feared that the graffiti might spark anti-Semitic riots in the area and ordered it to be washed away. So, the extensively mutilated and disemboweled body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered laying on a bed in a single room where she lived at 13 Miller Court off of Dorset Street at 10:45 a.m. on Friday the 9th, November 1888. She had been hacked beyond recognition. Her throat was severed down to her spine. Her abdomen was emptied of all of its organs. Her uterus, her kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and other viscera from her body placed beside her foot. On the bed, sections of her abdomen and thighs had been placed on the bedside table, and her heart was missing from the crime scene. So there was multiple ashes found within the fireplace, suggesting that Mary Jane's killer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the room as he mutilated her body. And a recent fire had been so severe enough to melt the solder between a kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate of the fireplace as well. So each of the canonical, I'm going to say that word wrong every time. Each of the canonical 5 murders happened at night and on or close to a weekend, either at the end of the month or week or after. Mutilations increasingly became more severe with each one, and as they proceeded, it seems that the attacker may have been interrupted. So Nichols, she didn't have any missing organs. Chapman, her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina were taken. Eddowes, her uterus and left kidney were removed, and her face was mutilated. Mary Jane Kelly, her body was extensively eviscerated. Her face was gashed in all directions, and the tissue of her neck being severed to the bone, although her heart was the only organ missing from the body. So, due to all this, they believe that the killer had a surgical background, which, I mean, as severe as it is, does not surprise me. So, like I said, we have our canonical 5, but there's actually a few more that happen in Whitechapel that may or may not be fully related to these cases. So, a lot of people believe that Mary Jane Kelly is the final victim of the Jack the Ripper, but we don't know. We don't know. And the only thing we know is that these crimes ended after Mary Jane Kelly due to either death, imprisonment, institutionalization, or immigration. And the Whitechapel murders, they do detail another 4 murders that occurred after them. Those are of Rose Milett, Alice Mckenzie, the Pinchin Street Torso, and Frances Coles. And so Rose Milett was strangled, and she was found in Clark's yard. and this happened on the 20th of December of 1888. There was no sign of the struggle, and police believe that she had either accidentally hanged herself with her collar or she committed suicide. However, there were faint markings left by a cord on one side of her neck, which suggested that she had been strangled. An inquest into Milet's death, and the jury had determined that she had been murdered. So Alice Mckenzie was murdered shortly after midnight, the 17th of July of 1889, in Castle Alley. She had been stabbed twice to her neck, and her left carotid artery had been severed. There were several minor bruises, cuts found on her body, which bore a 7-inch long superficial wound extending from her left breast to her navel or her belly button. One of the pathologists that examined her believed this was related to the Ripper cases, although his colleague also examined like the 3 previous victims and he didn't agree with it. So there's a lot of like wishy-washy. So the Pigeon Street torso was a decomposing headless and legless torso of an unidentified woman, and her age is between approximately 30 to 40, and it was discovered beneath a railway arch in Pigeon Street on the 10th of September of 1889. So there was bruising on the back, hip, and arm like areas that indicated that she had been extensively beaten before she died. The abdomen had also been mutilated, although her genitals weren't wounded. So she appeared to have been killed one day prior to discovery as well. The dismembered sections of the body are believed to have been transported to the railway arch and hidden under an old chemist. So at 2:15 a.m. on the 15th of February of 1891, they discovered the body of a 25-year-old prostitute named Frances Coles. She was lying beneath a railway arch at Swallow Gardens. Her throat had been deeply cut, but her body wasn't mutilated. This led to believe that her assailant had been interrupted. She was still alive, though. She did die, however, before medical help could arrive. So a man had earlier been seen drinking with her, and the two were known to have argued about 3 hours prior to her death. They did arrest this man and charge her with her murder, and he was briefly thought to be Jack the Ripper, but his charges were discharged and there was a lack of evidence. So another victim is that of Fairy Fay, and it's unclear whether or not this attack was real or fabricated as a part of Jack the Ripper lore. Now, Fairy Fay was given to an unidentified woman's body who was allegedly found in a doorway close to Commercial Road on 26th of December of 1887. And this is after a stake had been thrust into her abdomen. But there's no records of a murder like this in Whitechapel in and around that time. So they believe that maybe this was confused with the murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith, who had a stick or blunt object shoved into her vagina. But many authors agree that Fairy Fay never existed. There also was a 38-year-old widow named Annie Millwood, and she admitted to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary. She was admitted with numerous stab wounds to her legs and lower torso on the 25th of February of 1888. She informed staff that she had been stabbed with a clasp knife by an unknown man. She was later discharged, but she died of natural causes on the 31st of March. Millwood is to be known as the last Ripper victim, or could have been the first Ripper victim, although this attack can't be linked because they don't know. Now, basically, I think all of this case, like we don't know whether they're all related or not, and that's why truly it's a mystery. I mean, we have our own Jack the Ripper in the United States. We have H.H. Holmes, he's from New Hampshire, and a lot of people thought that it was him, but it wasn't. And then we have a lot of similar cases like the Ardenwald axe murders happening a year, literally a year prior to the Villisca axe murders. Everything is similar, so maybe it's the same dude. But I digress. I digress. Because sometimes I get on that wild tangent when it comes to murders. And I mean, I've been reading about Jack the Ripper for years, and every time I read about this case, I figure out something new. Do I believe it was a surgeon? Yes. Or somebody with a medical background. Do I believe that these women were picked off for a reason? Probably. They were easy targets. They were just there. Except for Mary Jane Kelly, she was the only one found in a bed, in her room. But the perpetrator was able to eliminate her room to make it seem that, or maybe he needed to have that feel of fire around him. But I don't know. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Leave them down below. I want to know. Give me all your thoughts and goodies. And if you have any crime you want me to cover, put it in a comment below. I am not shy. Bring it on. I want to talk about more crime and yeah, really just dive into this with you guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in my next true crime case.